Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move swiftly into our first panel this morning. We're very grateful to Congressman McGovern for kicking us off, and I think putting a lot of issues for U.S. policy out on the table. What we're going to do in this first panel, of course, we'll have a panel focused entirely on Bahrain at 10:45. This panel is going to look across the Gulf more broadly, and I really want to thank the NED and POMED for putting things together this way, because as I think the Congressman reminded us, the underlying changes in the region, in Arab society, the pressures for reform, for responsive and accountable government that respects human rights and provides opportunity to citizens, these pressures exist all across the region. There is no country in the region where these are not manifest. And that means that we need to consider how governments are responding and how societies are pressing these demands all across the region, including the other countries of the Gulf. And so I'm very, very grateful to the NED and POMED for bringing together this fantastic panel that will allow us to do that. You have the biographies of all of our speakers in your packets, so I'm not going to read them out at length. Let me just say we will go in the following order. First, we'll hear from our visitor, Jafar Alshayeb, a Saudi human rights activist and a member of the Qatif Municipal Council and a very thoughtful spokesman for reform in Saudi and in the Gulf more broadly. Then we'll hear from my colleague and friend, Laith Kubba, Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa here at the NED and a former advisor to the Iraqi government. Finally, we will hear from Ambassador Richard LeBaron, visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, author of a new, very worthwhile paper on the U.S. and the Gulf, looking closely at this question of demands for change and reform, and former ambassador of the U.S. to Kuwait. So, Jafar, we'll begin with you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll talk about the latest developments in the Gulf and specifically maybe to cover Saudi Arabia. Related to the developments in the last 2 years after the beginning of Arab Spring. In the beginning, I can say that in the Gulf, the demand for democracy and reform has been there for many decades. It's not something new. In all the GCC states, there has been different political groups and activists who are demanding the change toward democracy. But when the Arab Spring started, it gave, I think, the environment to openly talk about the need for the change and for power sharing in these states. So in Bahrain, I will not go into the details of it because you're going to have a session later on about Bahrain, but everybody knows what's going on since February 2011, all these developments and demands for reform. In Kuwait also, there is a wider demand for more political participation and power sharing with the ruling family. That is continuous, and people, they are boycotting elections and questioning their role and limitations that Sabah family is imposing. Maybe for the first time in Oman also, since the 60s, after the Jafar movement, we see demonstrations and protests from activists demanding more rights and participation, which led to many arrests. In fact, last week, the activists, about 12 of them, they started hunger strike. And today I heard Saeed al-Hashimi was moved to a hospital because of his illness after this strike. That is something to be looked at. And in Oman. In UAE, a continuation of petition writing by lawyers and civil society activists, also demanding respect of civil society and human rights and freedom of expression, which lead again for many arrests, including tens of activists, lawyers, such as Dr. Muhammad al-Rukn, who some of you may know, without a trial till now. In Saudi Arabia, which I'll go in more details, there has been since February and March 2011 a continuous demonstrations and public protests. In fact, in 2012 alone, there has been around 250 public protests in Saudi Arabia in a very restrictive environment where demonstrations are not allowed. People now, they are expressing their demand openly and challenging the government in different ways and in different regions, not only in the eastern province, but even in very conservative areas like Buraida and Riyadh and other places. I may go into details on that, but the main demands is the release of political prisoners who has been there for many years without trial. The government saying there are about 3,100 prisoners, but the estimation there are over 10,000 prisoners around the country. In these demonstrations, for the first time, female they are participating in the demonstration in a very conservative society where they go in public and they demonstrate in the streets and demanding the release of their prisoners' families. Also, female students in colleges and high schools, they are protesting, demanding better services, like what happened in Abha, University of Abha about 4 months ago, where there are thousands of female students protesting demanding better services from the university. So people, they are considering these alternatives more open, challenging to the government instead of just petition writings or meeting with the officials. Now they are crossing those borders and openly challenging the government, demanding for better services. The Arab Springs, in fact, has brought some challenges to the region, to the GCC states. I can here emphasize at least 3 very important issues. One of them is the ideological challenge. And these ruling families in the Gulf, they utilized the religious legitimacy to rule under the issue of the title of Ta'at Wali al-Amr, the obedience of the ruler. However, after the Arab Spring, that issue has been put in a question. Lots of intellectuals and writers and reformists, they are questioning the legitimacy of the state, of the government, based on that. In 2012 only, I followed like 4 important Saudi writers putting that big questions about the legitimacy of state, the religious legitimacy of the Saudi state. Professor Khalid al-Dakhil from King Saud University, he talked about the end of era of Wilayat al-Mutaghallib, the rule of the victor. Instead, he is demanding a more civilized, legitimate sources. And he takes the example of the Al-Azhar document, which was also published in 2011, as a source of legitimacy instead of just the rule of the victor, which has been the basis of the legitimacy in Saudi Arabia. Sheikh Salman al-Auda also wrote a very important book titled The Questions of Revolution. He is questioning all the justifications and reasons and the basis of the state, which are based on religious legitimacy And he is emphasizing the need to revive these ideas into a more civilized resources, including elections, to legitimize the political regime. A very important book by Abdullah al-Maliki. His book in Arabic is سيادة الأمة قبل تطبيق الشريعة. The rule of the nation or ummah before applying Sharia. This is very important, an intellectual writer who wrote, in more details about this. The last one is Dr. Abdullah al-Hamid, who is also challenging this issue by demanding a constitutional monarchy in Saudi Arabia, and he published many writings in that role. So this is very important because now there is a shift in the ideology of which is based on the legitimacy of on religion toward a more revived and civilized sources. After the Arab Springs and the participation of the Salafis around, especially in Egypt, Hizb al-Nur and others, in fact, that gave an example of the Salafis in Saudi Arabia who are being separated from participation to take Hizb al-Nur as a model of political participation. The second challenge is the political one, which means that the role of the ruling family, what is the limitations of being very absolute ruling families in the region. People now, they are demanding for more power sharing. That's creating a new challenge. All these demands are reform, like the example of Bahrain and other GCC. The people, they are demanding, this issue of political participation, respect of human rights. Third challenge is the social challenge. I think a rising awareness among the people, especially the youth and women, for more participation. People, they are not satisfied even with some of the government initiatives, which they consider it as very limited and very small steps that is not effective. Government response in most of these states, except for Oman, which in fact has developed, a wider popular participation policies. The governments are still using the financial, packages to delay these reforms, financial initiatives, especially in Saudi Arabia in March 2011, and introduced new initiatives, including fighting corruption, women and youth engagement, national dialogue, but they are not really genuine, steps. There are many restrictions on media and arrest of many of the people who are expressing their ideas, like Dr. Turki al-Hamad, for example, in Saudi Arabia, who've been arrested about a month ago, and many other bloggers and writers in Saudi Arabia. One major step also was the use of force, which is extraordinary measures that used in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain specifically. In Saudi Arabia, about 15 people has been killed since March 2011, protesters, and they are using live ammunition against people. One other also tool is the use of sectarianism between the Shia and the Sunnis, which led, in fact, to very social tension in the society, and the manipulation of power between different groups. Now, all these actions and initiatives taken by the government, in fact, had not led to any popular satisfaction. Still, people, they are not satisfied. As you know, in Saudi Arabia lately, the king, he has decided to include women in the Consultative Council. 30 women, they are appointed in the council. But for many people, it's just like a joke because, you know, there is no election where people now, they are expecting to participate through election, not through the appointment by the king. At this stage, what I feel is that there is very slow and very unplanned move from the government, which is not enough. On the other hand, you see a very growing popular demand and activities that's going on in the society from different sectors and different groups. Even people who used to be very close to the ruling family and very close to the government, now they are expressing their dissatisfaction, especially when it comes to the financial issues like the budget and distribution of the budget. In Saudi Arabia, aging issue is a big problem. Yesterday, one of the princes, the governor of Riyadh, has died, and the king is very ill. The crown prince is also. So that is, you know, something threatening the stability in Saudi Arabia. Finally, as the congressman was mentioning, I think it's very important to the stability in the region to consider all these developments and to really support the popular participation in the region and power sharing before things, you know, can move faster in a way that cannot be controlled. And it will be, you know, very dangerous if things, you know, broke down without any proper transformation of power to the society. I think the governments also, they have to face direct challenges that's growing. Among them is the succession, some of the social issues like unemployment, the Shia rights, religious minorities, or majority in some places, the issues of political prisoners and corruptions. Thank you.
Jafar, thank you so much for that. You raised some issues that are clearly shared concerns across the region, including concerns over corruption and inequality, and the issue of sectarianism, both real inequalities between populations and communities, but also the way in which sectarian identity and sectarian conflict can be manipulated by governments. And I think this is a really good jumping off point, perhaps, Laith, for your comments. So we look forward to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'll try to do is very quickly amplify some of the points I think Jafar made, and maybe to move from reading those signs that has been highlighted eventually to end up what options are out there, especially for the community that try to support democratic changes in the region. And broadly speaking, I think people in the Gulf expect something from the US. Of course, we're not in a position to comment about that, but I think it's useful to shed some light on the options and the trajectory of where things are going. I think what Jafar started with, giving us some of the signs of the tension in the region. As we speak, there are over 20 people on hunger strike in Oman. There are people imprisoned in Qatar and Kuwait. And of course, there are the ongoing events in the big three trendsetters, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. And I think we need to stop for a moment to see, do we really need to read, are we reading too much into these signs? Or maybe it is business as usual. After all, the Gulf is more resilient than the rest of the region. It's been having these issues for a while. We can live with that tension. The alternative, actually, to try to intervene and stir up things is high risk and messy. Those countries have enough sufficient, it's rentier economies, they have enough funds to give their citizens really a comfortable life. Where do we see those protests coming from, unlike Egypt or others? And that, after all, maybe they are doing some reforms, as Saudi Arabia is doing, allowing women maybe in 2 years to participate in local elections or appointing some women in some form of consultative form. So why are you stirring up issues in the Gulf? Why don't you leave it alone? And I think the big lesson one must remember, those arguments, I heard all of them when we were looking at Tunisia 3 years ago. In fact, when some Tunisians were telling me things are boiling underneath, you will see an eruption, I, amongst, I think the majority of people, never took them seriously. I knew that we have to stand by the people who advocate democracy, but I really did not believe things would erupt in Tunisia. And they did. Not only they erupted in Tunisia, they've unleashed a tsunami in the region that we've all witnessed. It is messy, it is risky, it's dangerous. Nobody went there and prompted it and asked for it. And I think on hindsight, a lot of people would say, you know what, reform should have been a far better course to take. Maybe then we could have absorbed those changes, we could have balanced our acts rather than opening up all sorts of risks to all sorts of players with totally unpredictable trajectory. If these arguments are right, and they taught us, a case in point, Libya, 40 years, the population there, conditioned by Gaddafi, and out of the blue, they rose. I have every reason to believe now that we need to take those signs that we're reading in the Gulf seriously, because underneath I can see things are accumulating. I can see the impact of a globalization where trends, you cannot live in an insulated bubble assuming your population are so comfortable and so conditioned, they are immune from the changes that take place out in the world, and you can buy their comfort and they will be quiet. The reason I amplify these remarks, I recently came back from Kuwait, and again, at least Ned, we paid some attention to the Gulf, but I think we're paying more attention to it now because there is a younger generation. For the first time, we used to hear the voices, let's say from elites, Western educated sometimes people, people who were at the peripheral of the social movements. But for the first time, we are seeing a younger generation. Their minds and their education clearly indicates there is a percentage of their profile, their emotional, psychological profile. They're very much global citizens. They want to be part of the rest of the world. And the slogan in Kuwait, for even when I was there were thousands of people demonstrating and clashing with police. The slogan was, "Not with bread alone nations live." That was something that was said in the streets. You just don't expect us to be quiet just because you're giving us money, and you have a system that is so outdated, it's embarrassing to all of us citizens. One might argue monarchies proved more resilient, and there is some truth in that, but I think the monarchies that in particular we're talking about in the Gulf are so exceptionally out of date and out of time that that bubble can burst at any moment, creating what concerns me, not democratic reforms, but maybe a backlash towards more Salafi trends, because they are up there, and I think if no measures are taken to carry out these reforms, then the risks that we're seeing with the Arab Spring and the challenges of the transitions are amplified if we are to look at them at the Gulf. I think we need to look a little bit closer at the actors that are driving the agenda. So far, the two consistent messages that are coming out, they're getting louder and clearer and stronger. One is there are calls for better governance. In particular, they are looking at the economies and corruption, and they're questioning for the first time, why should you, ruling families, own everything, stock and barrel, everything from the wealth to the land, and even to our rights as citizens, that you can, with a signature, cancel my citizenship and my relation to that nation and to that land. This is, by the way, the measure that is now proving to be, at least in the Emirate, most effective and as a deterrent, the citizenship of those who are even tweeting or speaking on human rights. They're threatened that their citizenship will be nullified, although they are citizens and they have no other citizenship to go to. But that reflects very much the type of regime that assumes ownership of the people, of the land, and of the wealth, and they want to continue with that mode of operation. Now, where are we expecting those voices to get their strength from? Of course, minorities in the region may be the first to be outspoken, but let us not forget there is expat workers. There is a large number of migrant workers. They don't have rights there. They can be cancelled and kicked out any minute. But again, they cannot be insulated from the changes that are taking place with the rest of the world. And I'm sure pressure will increase to include them and to protect their rights. And any movement to hold these governments to international standards at any level on any issue might help and might push the transformation in these countries. We have a growing generation of women who, again, their aspirations cannot be met under the regime, the current system or regime in the Gulf. And actually, we have a lot of people who are seeing sense and reason why reform is a better course than just wait and see, or the assumption of do no harm, don't touch it, because you might make it worse. Those reformers who are having more confidence that changes must take place, we're seeing them even amongst members of the royal families, and some of them are being silenced and pushed down. But we're seeing them, of course, far more amongst youth, amongst educated people, and amongst even some conservative circles. They're all advocating for reforms because they are a better option. Now, I think when it comes to us, the community of those supporting democracy, including NED, and supporting human rights, we have to have a better analysis on how to not only be effective, but also to abide by the concept of let's do no harm and how do we get it right? Where are the entry points? After all, I think the rationale amongst policymakers here at the US, you talk about the Gulf, the buzzwords are oil, stability, Iran, allies, interest, etc. I mean, there is a long list. And you have no question about the fact that they prefer to see reform in the region. The real challenge is how. How do you move on? Bearing in mind, there is no set model there is no other bubble in the world like the Gulf with such outdated system. It's not like Eastern Europe, it's not like Latin America, it's not like any of these countries. So how do you transform in these? Of course, you have to be innovative, and no change will be risk-free. But some guiding principles. One is you can never go wrong in amplifying and insisting on principles. It might have a side effect of being interpreted as putting pressure, but I think really that is a side effect that cannot be avoided. Second, you can never go wrong in aligning yourself with the people of the region. The royal families are not the people of the region, and the regimes that they have cannot be equated to those nations. And I think strategically it makes a lot of sense to take a stand aligning ourselves with the people in the region. I think when it comes to real measures, of course, the right trajectory is to try to have gradual reforms that are inclusive of actors rather than wait for things to blow up. And of course, I believe actors in the region do need help. They don't need maybe funds, but they do need a lot of help in designing modalities for these changes. I think there must not be a question about the direction where this should go, which is democratic systems, constitutional monarchies, but still democratic systems. That direction, I think everybody must move towards. the steps and the gradual moves and not risking stability, all these can be factored in. I have to stop here for time, and thank you very much.
Laith, thank you so much. I think that you have helped move our conversation in a very productive direction. We're sort of gently moving from the situation on the ground in the Gulf to the role of outside actors, including most notably the United States as we sit here in Washington. And I can't think of a better person to address that topic than Ambassador Rich LeBaron.
Thank you, and I do that with some modesty, especially with my distinguished members of this panel, and having experienced this a little bit as an ex-practitioner of diplomacy. Moving this needle is not a simple matter. And I think it's not a simple matter in the Gulf because we come at it from very different places. There's a huge trust deficit in the Gulf vis-a-vis the United States. People don't trust the United States at all, essentially. They admire us for our values and so forth, but they don't trust us as capable foreign policy practitioners. They look to Iraq. They think we delivered Iraq to Iran. They think we were incompetent. They look to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which they trusted us, especially the Saudis, trusted the United States to so-called deliver the Israelis to that process, at least to a process which doesn't even exist right now. So they don't trust us because of that. They worry that we'll strike some grand bargain with the Iranians and leave them hanging out to dry. And these are not just elites that worry about these things. I mean, in all the polling that I've seen of popular attitudes in the Gulf, there is no sense that the United States is a responsible player in the Middle East. So I think we have to realize that we start from a deep hole. I mean, we congratulate ourselves a lot on the admiration people have for our system, but we have to sit in that area a little bit and sit in their shoes and understand their view of the world a little bit and how they view the actions of the United States in recent times before we, as part of analyzing how we can have any influence on events there. The other place, thing we come from very, very different directions is the view of democratic transitions around the Middle East. We view these as inevitable, natural, beneficial, helpful in the long run. They view the regimes in the Gulf view these as existential threats. And so you start from a very different place. They view the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is in power in Egypt as not a symptom, but a manifestation of a long-term strategy by the Brotherhood to take over the Middle East. And they view their goals, they view their actions in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia as the battle for the Middle East. So it's not about reform for them, it's about survival. So they start from that place as well. And I think we really need to recognize that if we're to devise any sort of strategy that has any chance of having a long-term impact and isn't just seen as mindless meddling. So how does the U.S. respond to these issues? How do we do it constructively and effectively? Well, I think we really need to figure out our own strategy a little bit. I mean, what I hear in this conversation, for example, that the congressman refers to models of democratic monarchy. My colleague referred to constitutional monarchy. Now, if that's our starting point for the conversation, if we say to these regimes, here we go on the path to constitutional monarchy or democratic monarchy, they will shut down. They will go elsewhere, in my view. And now, if that's the goal, to put them out of business, and we say it right up front, and we can expect that they will say to us, thank you very much, and ignore us. And they have the ability, in the end, they have the ability to ignore us. And there's several reasons for that. But over time, we are pivoting to Asia. They are pivoting to Asia. The Chinese are going to be much more sympathetic to less democratic regimes because they're not going to be wanting to encourage democratic regimes in the Gulf. So they can create their own environment as well in which they circle the wagons around their own systems. We also have to be, I think, as part of a sustained dialogue with our friends in the Gulf, we also have to be thinking of some of these moves that they're making in places like the UAE, for example. You know, the UAE might be, in my view, it may be developing slowly a more participatory form of governance that they can live with. I'm not sure of this. It's a hypothesis that's worth testing. But if we're unwilling to test their hypotheses, and we only come up with a formula that says everything we need to do in the way of reform leads to constitutional monarchy, then we're not having a dialogue. We're telling them what to do and what the direction is. On how we do these things and how we balance, I'm always puzzled by these debates between values on the one side and national interests or strategic interests on the other. I mean, the United States is a superpower. We have lots of interests. I mean, we have to act like a superpower. We have to pursue these interests at the same time. And we can do that. I mean, when I was in Kuwait, we were the gas station and the supply depot for the Iraq War. And that was, that was the foreign policy priority of the administration. Nonetheless, that administration also pushed very hard for women's vote. And that was passed in 2005. And it was not, it was due to a lot of pressure from Kuwaiti women, but it was also due to a president in the United States who cared about that issue. And the United States also cared about expatriate labor, and we talked a lot about expatriate labor, much to the embarrassment of the Kuwaitis and to the chagrin of the Kuwaitis, and made some modest progress. But I think we have to be careful in the choices we offer. The congressman talked about a choice offered to the Bahrainis that says gradual reform or we start to move our ships elsewhere. If the Bahrainis go to Riyadh and discuss that choice, I'm pretty sure I know where their decision's going to come down. So before we lay out these levers that we think we have, we better play them out a little bit. We better game them out a little bit and think about our own strategy over time. Because I'm pretty sure that the main patron is not the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. The main patron of Bahrain is Saudi Arabia. And if given the choice, who will the Bahrainis, who will the Al-Khalifas choose? And what impact will that have on the prospects for democratic or wider participation by Shia in the political system in Bahrain? I think it could have huge unintended consequences. So I think we need to be really clear on what we want, on how we conduct a dialogue without spooking our partners. We have to be clear that we're going to have long-term interests in the Gulf for a long time. So we have to be thinking about what is our time horizon for this gradual reform, and how do we conduct ourselves within that time horizon. We have to to defend our own principles. We have to push back against this rise of sectarianism. We have to be alert to protection of minorities and women. But at the same time, I think my takeaway from this discussion is we have to be very careful in developing and understanding our own strategy and not speaking casually about constitutional monarchies and democratic monarchies as if these are animals that will exist at some future date in the Gulf, because I don't think they will. Thanks.
Richard, thank you. We're going to open this up for questions from the audience in just a moment. I want to, if I may, pose a little bit of a question up here, because I think that I heard some divergence even amongst our panelists about recommendations for the United States in approaching this issue. And I think, Richard, you raised the need to be sensitive to what the other side is bringing to this conversation if you want to have impact. And that is, of course, the heart of diplomacy, is being able to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. It strikes me also that there's, to some degree, an assumption that these conversations are in the context of a relationship that goes beyond interests, that it's not merely a transactional back and forth. And I guess that's the question I'd like to get to, prompted by Congressman McGovern's remarks about Bahrain. If we presume that the U.S. and the Gulf states have relationships because they have interests in our engagement with them and our presence in the region and our cooperation with them, and we have interests in our relationship with them and their cooperation with us, where does the question of reform and stability fit into that interest-based dialogue? One could look at the issue of Fifth Fleet basing, for example, not in terms of leverage. We have a relationship that gives us leverage. Let's use that leverage as a threat. But rather in terms of mutual interests. We both have an interest in having the Fifth Fleet in the Gulf. That's why it's there. That's how it got there. Our concern is that instability in the Gulf and instability in Bahrain makes it more and more difficult for us to securely base. One could make the argument that the history of the last 2 years shows that despite many assurances by our Gulf partners that they've got this situation under control and it will all blow over, that there is no security solution to the challenge they are facing, and that indeed the continued instability is directing more and more resentment not only against the Bahraini government, but also against us. We see demonstrations outside that base that we didn't see 2 years ago. To me, that suggests that an interest-based dialogue is not about threats and leverage, but it is about the need to do, each of us, what we need to do to satisfy our mutual interests. And I would love to get the thoughts of the panel on that. I'd also love to get Laith and Jafar's reaction to Richard's concern about setting constitutional monarchies as the objective. From the perspective of those on the ground who are driving change, is the goal of constitutional monarchy the necessary vision? Is that what they're driving for? Rather than something we're bringing, is it something that's coming from inside? And if so, how can those demands be mediated with the regime's resistance to such a vision? So maybe we'll start with Jafar and we'll just go down the line.
Well, government in the region, they will resist or reject any kind of reform, either if it's coming from its own people or from outside. Even small reform steps will not be acceptable to them. They had to do it because they did it because they had to do, these small changes based on the developments in the region, based on the demand of the people and the pressure they are in. But if we wait until they will accept a proposal from their own people or from an outside, it will never happen. What is the problem, I think, with the U.S. policy here? It's not listening to the people voices. It gets its information from the official side. And the official side, they paint a picture that we can control, we will have the stability in the state. And if there is any shuffling or changes, then the Salafis will come, the Ikhwan Muslimin will come, other forces will come, and all these threats are coming, and the Iranians will utilize that. So they, draw these pictures to make threats of any changes. That's even between the people themselves. Like they say to the Shia, we are protecting you, and if there is anything happen to us, then the Salafis will come over and take over and will do something totally dangerous to you. And they say also to the Salafis the same thing. So they are playing around with, these ideas. I believe the U.S. can play a very important role and very constructive. We are not demanding a revolution. We demand a constructive reform. And I think a more institutionalized governments will help the stability in the region for long term. Why in Kuwait we don't have radicals, we don't have bombing? Why in Saudi Arabia we have that? Because there are more popular participation in Kuwait. There are more freedom, more channels of expression that people they can elect, they can participate. All the groups, the Ikhwan Muslimin and the Salafis and the Shia, they can express their role. We don't have that in Saudi Arabia. That's why there is, it's very closed system, very rigid system, and you don't know what's the future of it. It's really a big threat because nobody expects how the change will come in the near future even. There are tensions between the tribes, there are regional tensions, there are sectarian tensions in the country. That's very, fragile situation. And if we just wait until the government will be convinced to take a reform step, that will never happen. I think that will never happen. The U.S. should utilize its strategic relation, economic, defense, and all political influence in the region to reform these political systems in a very gradual way, in a more participatory governments. And I think the government, in many cases, they accepted these kinds of advices even. In 1991, when King Fahd approved the establishment of consultative council, it was at the time of the Gulf War, and he accepted these proposals. And as Ambassador Richard said, in Kuwait, even the women participation in the election was proposed by the U.S. So I think these kinds of advices and steps toward more reform and more popular participation is very important, and I think that will stabilize the region and guarantee its stability and relations with the U.S. Otherwise, people, they are looking at the U.S. now as the enemy of reform. There are many violations, human rights violations in the region, but nobody is talking about it. All the human rights organizations, they are reporting, but nothing from the United States, about this. While the Iranians now, they are making a bigger propaganda out of it. If there is a demonstration in Qatif or in Bahrain, you see all the media, Iranian media, they are utilizing it. So people, they will think that the supporters to the reform, Iranians are the U.S.
Thank you, and I think you raised another very interesting point that I want to highlight, which is that in Saudi, the lack of any roadmap from the leadership is creating its own uncertainty, anxiety, and difficulty for everybody. So, okay, you don't like the idea of constitutional monarchy, but where are you taking the country? People need to know. Laith.
Well, thank you, Richard, for the notes you made, Ambassador. But let me just say that we both agree that those royal families, ruling families, have ruled for 100 years because they are pragmatists. They balanced the tribal nature, the conservative nature, and part of them are liberals and Western interest, and this is their real skill and ability. And I think within that context, and within very much interest-based discussion or dialogue, one needs to revisit the signs that are emerging in the region, because it is going to threaten not only them as royal families, the way I'm reading it and the message we're trying to put forward. I think it'll threaten also the US interest because of that instability. And I think it's very much from that perspective that the world has changed, that the younger generation and those trends that are now pushing towards change are very much on the increase. And I think it's a given that is shared between the US and the royal families there, that change is inevitable and the reforms are necessary. I think the difference is cost-benefit risk analysis. How do we navigate our way through? Any change will be resisted by built-in interest and habits of the past and traditions. This is a given. And of course, there are hardliners and those who are open to reform. I do believe if they are our allies and if we want to look out of our interest, we need to have a more honest conversation. We need to spell out the real alternatives, which will be far worse. And I'm not amplifying this to scare anybody, because let us not forget, in 1979, Juhayman took over the Holy Shrine. They had to bring French troops to go and fire bullets there to dislodge and to have a grand deal with the Salafi movement to empower them, just to keep them at check. Now, with the open space, with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, those royal families who are not Salafis themselves, they can be pushed out of power easily. Their strategic allies are the liberals and the women and all other reformers who would like to see a better trajectory for their country. Wait and see feels good just at the time being and leave us alone and all these things. But the reality is, if you read all the signs, to me, I am worried. And Iran does exist, and it's a real power that has consolidated its influence. Those trends are real, and I do believe it is very much within the framework of the discussion over our interests and their interest that reform must take place. And we need to help them with modalities. We need to differentiate those who ought to be engaged. And this institution, amongst others, have a set of skills and history and relationships. And we've been helping groups across the board.
Thank you. Richard.
I'll just be very brief. I agree with most of what you're saying. I think it's more, my comments are more sort of the experience of a practitioner trying to navigate this balancing of interest and hierarchies of interest and ability to influence positive change and how we do that. I think we do need an interest-based dialogue. I mean, for one simple reason, we're a superpower that doesn't like to be surprised. I mean, one of the mottos of the Middle East Bureau that never had much efficacy was no surprises. And we were always being surprised. And when we were in Cairo, for example, when I worked with Dan Kurtzer in Cairo, before Mubarak visited the United States, every time before he went, we would write a very limited distribution cable to Washington, and we'd say, it's time for the conversation. Everybody knew what the conversation was. The conversation was, you've got to do something about this emergency law. You've got to start opening up. You've got a pressure cooker there. And we said to our system, we've got to have these conversations. Our system chose not to, because Mubarak was our guy on the peace process. Mubarak was our guy on the Suez Canal. Mubarak was the bulwark against Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And so we made choices at very senior levels at that time. I agree that we now need to make a choice that says we need to have an interest-based dialogue with these rulers in the Gulf. But my only hesitation is if we start laying out our vision too boldly, they'll go into hibernation, and if we don't do this with some skill, it just won't work. And so, I fear that we don't recognize also some of the long-term dynamics in places like Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's changing, and we need to understand the internal changes before we start fiddling around and offering solutions.
All right, thank you very much. Let me open it up and just make one brief comment, which is that I think, Richard, one of the points you just made that's very interesting is that a lot of times the conversation doesn't happen because the United States government decides on its own not to have it. And so we never even get to the point of seeing how our interlocutors in the region might respond. That may be something that we need to think harder about today, although I'll tell you that Secretary Clinton meeting with a group of regional activists in January of 2011 was pressed on this point by them, and she said, look, sometimes we do have that conversation, and it's like talking to a wall. So with that, let me open it up, and we'll start with Carl Gershman.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to follow this conversation, which I find, very interesting and very frank, which is very good, and thank you for introducing it this way. Where I differ is that, you treat Congressman McGovern as if he's a U.S. policymaker, and therefore he should, be out there enunciating, carrying out that dialogue. That's not the way our system works. I mean, he's in Congress. He's a pressure point on our government as well as, dealing as he can with the governments there. And that's the way it works. I mean, where our Congress is always going to be taking a stronger position on these issues, maybe being out front a little bit more, maybe making, the life of our negotiators and policymakers a little bit more difficult because they're putting a lot of pressure on. They're raising concerns on the other side that maybe, the U.S. has these hardliners and so forth. That's in a way, it makes your job a little bit easier, in my view, as a negotiator, because they may be more likely to talk to you if they think that the alternative to you are people who are going to take a much stronger position and maybe pass the Magnitsky bill. And similarly, with with institutions like NED and human rights organizations, it's a pluralistic system, and I just don't see our government, which doesn't have it doesn't have a strong interest in carrying out that conversation, as you say, and really exercising pressure. And so in the end, what happens is exactly what happened in Egypt. Nothing happens, and then there's an explosion. And the question is there a way around that? And I don't know that there is unless, unless some people are going to really try to exercise some pressure on this situation. And it's not going to be pressure if Congressman McGovern comes here and frankly takes the line that you took this morning.
Okay, and rather than have us respond individually to each question, maybe we'll gather a few from the audience and then we'll come back up so we can get more participation. Right there in the center, Greg.
Hi, Greg Aftandilian, Center for National Policy. My question is for Jafar on the royal family in Saudi Arabia. You mentioned that, it's an aged and ill leadership right now. What about the younger generation within the royal family? Are there progressive elements who actually do understand the need for reform? And what are their chances of influencing the top leadership of the royal family? Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can take one more. Ali, here in the front.
Thank you, Ali Abu Zakuk. Just a note of, activities in December 2005. CISID did a conference there. We did a conference about democracy, shura, and good governance. For the first time in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, women attended, women lectured, and it was something we have seen, the undercurrent of the activities of the civil society activists there. It's a vital society over there. People don't see it on the surface. My question is for the panelists. I have heard about the question of the principles and the values. I wonder, and you are Ambassador LeBaron, you are a practitioner of policy. How much do we, in reality, vis-a-vis our interests as the United States, what weight does principles of human rights, democracy, and so on, and the values of our Constitution weigh vis-a-vis the interests of having the oil, having stability of the area there? Thank you.
Okay, so a couple of questions on U.S. policy and a couple on Saudi Arabia. Jafar, do you want to start?
Well, I'll take the one Saudi Arabia. I think it's becoming now very urgent to move toward the younger generation, and I think the king has introduced some of the third generation of the ruling family to high positions. Lately, only before the appointment of Mugran as the second deputy, there was only one member in the Council of Ministers of the second generation. Now more are engaged. Mohammed bin Naif, the Minister of Interior, and Mansour bin Mit'im, Minister of Municipality, and there is a big chance for Khalid bin Sultan to be the Minister of Defense, So I think there are steps toward more engagement of the younger generation in the family to be in the government, high positions. I think, there are some positive things in that because they are closer to the to understand, to close the generation gaps between what's going on in the society and how the top governments look at things. There's really big gap and differences in that. So to close that gap, I think the appointment of the younger generation, high position, that might help positively, at least in developing better government, better policies toward people, like the control of of corruption or employment, these kinds of issues that still there. But one of the threats is that this younger generation, they don't have the same experience as the old ones in dealing with the diversity in the country. The second generation, they are dealing with different tribes, different regions, because they've been there for a long time and they understand the structure better. The younger generation, they don't have that much passion and understanding of the structure, which will make it difficult for them to deal with these developments and with these kinds of threats that's existing. Maybe from some of the people observations also, these young generations, they lived all their life as royals. Okay, they have not been through difficult times, difficult periods. So they are more open to corruption, to all these stuff which they lived all their life in that situation. So there are many difficult challenges in those appointments. But I think slowly the king is moving toward engaging more of them into government high positions now.
Thank you. Laith, do you want to add anything?
A quick word. I think when it comes to the principles and values, there are a set of values that are existential, universal. They're beyond any cultural location or area or a preference for a political system. And I think on those, the people in the Gulf are moved by them, irrespective whether the U.S. is with them or against them, whether with or without the U.S. I think people will move in that direction and are moving in that direction. I fully understand and I amplify the point that Carl made about the division of labor in a way, and that surely the U.S. government would focus on interest. That's its job, that's its mandate. But surely other institutions and other organizations ought to amplify what they're tasked to do. And I think Ned and amongst others have to emphasize that. I think the important point here is those trends are going to move in the region, and whether we like it or not, the U.S. government will be forced to react. You do not want to go and address those issues. Those issues will come and address you here. And I think the U.S. is bound to react, and it's better to be, in my view, proactive in reading the sign and reacting to them than just to wait for things to happen. And then we're caught up, as we were with Tunisia and Egypt, running after the events and being criticized from every corner and not getting it right. So that's the reason I think this conversation is to move the discussion forward, hopefully with some insights.
Thanks, Laith. And before I turn to Richard, I'll just say from my own experience, brief experience as a practitioner in the State Department, Carl, I think what you say about the pluralistic nature of the American political system and the good cop, bad cop, if you will, between Congress and the executive branch is important. It's a very important feature of our system. It can be functional in dialogue with other governments. But the pluralistic nature of our system is also something that's difficult for people who do not exist in such a system to grasp. And so there's often an ascription of intentionality to the executive branch for actions that may be taken by civil society. in the U.S. or actions that may be taken by the Ned in the U.S. And that can complicate the conversation. So I think it's a double-edged sword, but I'd love Richard's thoughts as well.
Well, I think I'd like to elaborate on this formula, I mean, of sort of competing interests within the U.S. system. I mean, another way to fashion that is a sharing of roles, where the administration is in close contact with the congressman constantly about how to strategize, and in close contact with Ned and other groups on how to strategize and use the comparative advantage of each group. So I see it, you know, you have two, your model was the sort of competitive influence or, you know, pushing the system from the outside. Another valid model that's been used in some cases effectively is collaboration and quiet collaboration and a sharing of roles. So I think that's worth considering in this case, because I think we really haven't had the conversation here about what do we want? What do we really want? And so that I think would be helpful to organize, you know, a conversation among policymakers and interested congressmen and members of Congress to really explore these issues and explore the sort of how do you balance things and how do you think about this issue. I have to come back to this values versus interest thing. You know, it just, I'm not getting my head around this. I mean, if you're out there representing the United States and you receive instructions from your government to do things, you have to presume, because you work in a democratic system, that those instructions represent the values of the American people and its elected representatives and the administration they elected. So, you know, this separation of values and interests, I'm not buying it. It's a difference of interest and a difference of where you want the certain interests, where your particular interest is in the hierarchy at any one time, and how strongly the United States is playing that particular note. But, you know, let's get off this values and interests as if they're opposing things. If our actions in the world don't reflect our fundamental values, we've got a big problem. It's a lot bigger than how we act in the Middle East.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more round of questions. Oops, sorry. I think we have time for one more round of questions right here in the aisle. Chris.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question has to do with the term they. I always note with interest when there's a discussion of authoritarian countries, the term they is used, and it's not only relevant to the Middle East. Hear this in Central Asia, for example, what they would be willing to accept or what they would want. And typically that's shorthand for the authorities in these countries. And I think one of the things that's changed in the Middle East context, certainly in the last 2.5 years, is that the they in the equation has changed. So you now have voices, the younger generation, the demography is changing in these countries. And I'd like to ask the panelists to talk a bit about something Ambassador LeBaron alluded to, which is, and perhaps this can be framed purely as an interests dimension of the challenge, how you would frame from a USG point of view the sort of reform approach that would be applicable to changing circumstances. So right now, there seems to have been a default to a status quo policy in the region. If you look at Egypt, that's very much the case. But the circumstances are changing. We know they're changing. So I'd be curious to know in more practical terms and more concrete terms how you would frame this to recognize the changing reality.
Okay, so it's sort of how do you broaden the conversation? Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself.
Nader Tadrous with Solidarity Center. And my point has to do, actually, we've been focusing on problems more than opportunities, I think. And I know that one of the opportunities that the panel has identified, which is the working with the youth. However, I see an opportunity that's not talked about much, which is the situation in Qatar. I see that Qatar has a big opportunity of change because of the World Cup of 2022. And I see that this is something that we can really capitalize much on. And I know that this will probably have to do with more with the labor force there and the migrant labor. But we can use this also to push for like unions. We can push for human rights. We can push for democracy and the basic ideas of human rights. And I wonder why, it was not talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in the back, in the green jacket. Yeah.
Hanan Zalwani Idrisi, National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you very much for our panel for this great comments on the situation in the Gulf. My question is specifically for Mr. Jafar Alshayeb. I would like you to comment a little. We hear a lot about the divide and the conflicts in the royal family in Saudi Arabia. And I'd like you to elaborate on that in the sense of how it is going to, first of all, how the king and his environment is dealing with that and responding to that. And from the other aspects on how it is going to, is it going to be an added value in what the pro-democratic voices in the Gulf talking about the power sharing, or is it going to be something that we don't have to factor in and we need to look for other opportunities? Thank you.
Okay, so I think what we've got is a set of questions around inclusion. And what is it, what are the changing realities within society and the demands, as Laith was pointing out, for active citizenship? What is that demand both from the U.S. in the way it engages in these conversations about reform in the region, and what is it going to demand of governments? And then also this question of Qatar, which actually none of us did mention. So let's see who can address Qatar. Why don't we start on this end this time, Rich?
I'll be very brief because I feel like I've talked too much already. But I think there's a myth out there that until the Tunisian revolution, U.S. diplomats and policymakers only dealt with elites. That's not true. It hasn't been true for as long as I've been in the Foreign Service. I mean, we have reached out to civil society groups, to minority groups, to youth. I mean, there's always been a perennial thing. How do we influence youth as if they were some sort of a homogenous group as well? But so, I think the key to diplomacy is just to keep at it and keep at it across a broad front. And there are no magic solutions that will produce immediate results. I think action forcing events like the World Cup indeed provide opportunities, and already the Qataris are responding to that and changing some of their practices vis-a-vis expatriate labor. This expatriate labor issue is one that deserves a lot more attention. This is corrupt, it's exploitative, and it's, somebody out there, some Pakistani engineer working in Qatar is going to figure out a way to throw the whole thing out the window one of these days. So that revolution is coming, and we do need to continue to have a dialogue about that issue. I think of Qatar and UAE basically, though, just to touch on Qatar, I think of both Qatar and UAE less as countries than as brands, and brands run by families. And they protect that brand. They have great airlines. They have great hotels. They have great relations with elites in the United States, in the media, in government, and even in civil society. They support think tanks. They do all the right kind of things to protect their brand. And so I think we need to sort of fashion our conversation about, with them, recognizing that your brand is tarnished by what you're doing. And think that through with them a little bit if they really want this brand to survive.
Thank you. Laith, and then we'll finish with Jafar.
I think just maybe two quick notes. Number one, I want to emphasize, I do not believe what we're doing here in the U.S. towards the Gulf is heading in the wrong direction or doing the wrong things. I do believe we are doing the right things and we're in the right direction. But I believe we need to do more, and we need to do it in a more thoughtful and intelligent way. And I do believe we're behind time because all the signs indicate that there is pressure mounting up and we need to move on this much quicker. I believe if there is an error, it is not moving fast enough on that topic. And also I think more is needed, not only from the US, but also from the US in a sense, including our community of organizations in helping the region technically. I don't think they need financial help, but definitely they need a lot of technical help, especially the forces that are demanding democratic reforms. I think genuinely need help in navigating their way, as much as governments and reformists within royal families, they need help too. And maybe one last note I want to put, just looking ahead to the future, I have no question we're going to address Bahrain, but Bahrain and what happens in Bahrain is so important despite all the difficulties, because if there is one small lab where we can test the democratic transformation safely, it'll be Bahrain. I think Kuwait has a lot of opportunities. There is something very real fermenting in Kuwait, and I think we need to look at it much closer. But again, stepping back, big picture, I must give credit to Morocco being a monarchy, but it's actually moving in the right direction and loosening its powers. And I think it'll get itself out of the woods safely. Maybe it'll end up with a constitutional monarchy there.
Thank you, and we'll give our final word on this panel to our guest from the region, Jafar.
Thank you. Regarding the questions of the conflict in the royal family, I think it's like any other family. There are, struggle and conflict and on power, but that is what that's not the thing that we bid on it, because at the end they will find solution to resolve all these conflicts to guarantee their staying in power and their continuity, because since the existence, the struggle was there between different forces in the government, as family issues or on the political views as well. There are some of them who are reformists, who wants to see developments and changes. Some of them are very conservative. Some of them, they make alliance with the religious establishment to protect their positions. So these kinds of manipulation of their relations is there, and I think it will continue. But for us as human rights activists and people who are looking for reform, that's not the big deal, I think. That's not the issue there. The issue is whoever in power in the government should recognize the need for reform and the need for the changes. As I said, some of them are more willing to listen and to support some of these demands. That is where we need to work with. Regarding the second issue of the dialogue, I think it's very important to really broaden the dialogue, as suggested by one of the participants here, because my understanding is that the U.S. Diplomats and agencies there, they are just dealing with very limited people, official or semi-official, people. They are not open to the society. They are not open to the younger generation who are now, very active, and that needs to be resolved, and to really build up a relation of partnership in reform, not partnership in violations with the government, because this is the view many people is looking to the U.S. as they are, keeping blind eyes from all these violations that's going on in the region, and they just partners with the governments instead of the people. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for this very rich conversation. We're going to take a short coffee break, and we will reconvene here precisely at 10:45. Thanks very much.